It was March of 1944. The sky over occupied France was heavy with dense clouds that seemed to weigh down the land. The wind blew steadily, carrying with it the distant echo of engines piercing the horizon. At American air bases in England, pilots adjusted their leather helmets as they observed the unstable weather. The air war over Europe had become a routine of calculated losses and costly victories. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from right now? Comment below with your city or country. It's always impressive to see how far these stories reach across the globe. Now, let's go back to that day, where it all began. The United States Army Air Force faced a dilemma that had persisted since 1943. High-altitude strategic bombing raids by massive formations of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers were achieving their objectives of destroying German industrial infrastructure, but the price was brutal. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, intercepted these formations with Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 199 fighters, shooting down dozens of bombers before they could return to base. American fighter pilots, flying Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and North American P-51 Mustangs, did their best to protect the bombers, but the tactical advantage still belonged to the Germans. The problem was simple and deadly. Luftwaffe fighters took off from bases across France, Belgium, and Germany as soon as radar detected American formations. They climbed rapidly to intercept the bombers at combat altitude between 6,000 and 8,000 meters. After the attack, they descended safely to refuel and return to the air. This aerial dance repeated itself daily, and American losses remained unacceptable. The logic of the game needed to change. At the 8th Bomber Command, commanders discussed alternatives. Increasing the number of escorts didn't solve the core problem. The Germans still had time to take off, form up, and attack. Destroying the airstrips was difficult. High-altitude bombing rarely hit such small targets accurately. The solution needed to be different. It needed to be unexpected. It was then that a controversial proposal emerged. Instead of escorting bombers or patrolling at altitude, the fighters would descend deeply, fly as low as the treetops, and attack German airfields directly from the ground. The idea seemed suicidal. Flying at low altitude meant being within range of light anti-aircraft guns, ground-based machine guns, and even rifles. It meant losing the advantage of speed and altitude. It meant turning air superiority fighters into ground attack aircraft, a mission they were not designed for. But the proposal carried a relentless logic. If the German fighters were destroyed on the ground, they would never reach the bombers. If the crews were forced to disperse or take cover, they would not be able to take off in time. And if the Luftwaffe lost its rapid response capability, air control over Western Europe would change hands. The risk was enormous, but the strategic payoff could be decisive. The man chosen to lead this new doctrine was neither a stunt pilot nor a hunter of enemy aces. He was Major James Howard, a 31-year-old native of Canton, Missouri. Howard had volunteered with the Chinese Air Force before the United States entered the war, flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against the Japanese. His aerial combat experience was vast, but his mindset was that of a cold-blooded tactician. He understood that war was not fought by heroic gestures, but by decisions that altered the balance of power, and that decision demanded absolute discipline. Howard received direct orders: assemble a group of experienced pilots, train in extremely low-altitude flying, study maps of enemy bases, identify takeoff patterns and approach routes, learn to read the terrain like infantry, not like an aviator. The task was clear: transform fighters into ground predators. The first test would be conducted over occupied France, where dozens of German airfields operated with impunity. The operation had no official name. It was merely an attempt, a calculated gamble against established doctrine. Preparations began in silence. At British air bases, mechanics worked under dim lights, adjusting Republic P-47 Thunderbolts for the new mission. The plane was robust, heavy, with a metal fuselage that could absorb small arms fire. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower, allowing it to quickly enter and exit combat zones. But flying low was different. There was no margin for error. A deviation of even a few meters meant crashing into a tree, a church steeple, or a power line. The psychological pressure was immense. James Howard gathered the selected pilots in a windowless room. He didn't give motivational speeches. He simply laid maps on the table and began speaking. His voice was calm, direct and devoid of drama. He explained that the mission wasn't about shooting down enemies in the air. It was about denying the enemy the ability to fly, destroying parked aircraft, setting fuel depots ablaze, forcing the Luftwaffe to abandon forward bases. He showed aerial reconnaissance photographs taken days earlier, airfields with neat rows of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lined up like pieces on a chessboard. Perfect targets, but protected by Flak 38 anti-aircraft batteries and machine gun positions. The pilots listened in silence. Some exchanged glances. Others simply studied the maps. No one questioned the order. They knew the alternative was to continue losing bombers, to continue watching entire formations be decimated before completing their missions. Howard explained the tactics. Approach in low formation, below 50 meters. Use of terrain to mask the approach. Surprise attack at dawn or dusk, when visibility was compromised. Short, precise bursts against aircraft on the ground. Immediate departure, without circling to assess damage. Speed was the only protection. Training began over the English countryside. Pilots flew at altitudes that made ground observers flinch in fear. They learned to read the terrain, use hills and valleys for cover, and calculate distances without instruments. Howard led each flight, demonstrating how to bank the aircraft to avoid structures, how to adjust power to maintain stability at low altitude, and how to identify targets at maximum speed. There was no room for hesitation. The window of opportunity in a ground attack lasted seconds. A mistake meant death, or allowing the enemy to react. In mid-April 1944, the order arrived. The first mission would be flown against a German base near the French city of Reims, in the Champagne-Ardenne region. Reconnaissance photographs showed 16 Messerschmitt, 109 fighters, stationed in a scattered but predictable pattern. The base had modest anti-aircraft defenses, ideal for an initial test. The attack would be conducted by 8 P-47s, divided into 2 formations of 4 aircraft each. Howard would lead the first. The chosen time was dusk, when the low sun would hinder the German gunners' vision. On the morning of the mission, the weather was unstable. Low clouds covered the English Channel. Crosswinds buffeted the aircraft during takeoff. Howard didn't alter the plan. He knew that difficult conditions would also affect enemy defenses. The formation crossed the channel at medium altitude, then gradually descended as it approached the French coast. 100 meters above the ground, the pilots adjusted their position, flying side by side with minimal wing spacing. The sound of the engines echoed across the countryside, but the speed was so high that French peasants barely had time to look up before the planes disappeared over the horizon. Howard followed visual cues. A country road, a stone bridge over a river, a row of poplars marking a farmstead. Every detail had been memorized. Low-altitude navigation didn't allow for map consultation. Everything depended on memory and instinct. The formation sliced through the air like blades, angling to follow the terrain. At times, the wheels nearly brushed the treetops. His heart raced, but his hands remained steady on the controls. Then, on the horizon, the base appeared. A flat field with metal hangars and planes arranged in irregular lines. Wooden control towers, parked vehicles, German soldiers moving leisurely. No one expected an attack. No one looked at the low sky. Howard said nothing over the radio. He simply tilted his left wing slightly, a prearranged signal. The other pilots adjusted their formation. The 50 caliber machine guns were cocked. Howard's finger touched the trigger. The distance was closing with each passing second. The wind whistled against the fuselage. And then the first shot shattered the silence of the French afternoon. The sound of 50 caliber machine guns ripped through the air like fabric being torn. The bursts came in short, controlled bursts, each projectile tracing an invisible line between the nose of the P-47 and the targets on the ground. Howard aimed at the first Messerschmitt on the left of the line. The impacts shook the German fighter's fuselage. Sparks flew from the metal. Within seconds, yellowish flames began to rise from the wing where the fuel tanks were located. He didn't wait to confirm the destruction. He was already adjusting his aim to the next target. The other pilots followed suit. Each chose a different plane. The bursts were fast, precise, calculated to cause maximum structural damage without wasting ammunition. The Messerschmitts on the ground had no chance to react. They were just inert, exposed, vulnerable machines. But the entire base woke up in a matter of seconds. Sirens began to wail. German soldiers ran toward the anti-aircraft positions. Orders were shouted in German, but chaos had already ensued. No one knew where the attackers were coming from. The altitude was so low that the American planes seemed to appear out of nowhere. Howard pulled back slightly on the stick to gain a few feet of altitude and avoid a radio tower that appeared ahead. The maneuver was instinctive but controlled. Beside him, another P-47 fired into an open hangar. The shells pierced the thin metal walls and struck a storage area of fuel drums stacked inside. The explosion was immediate. An orange fireball shot up through the roof, ripping off entire sheets of metal that flew like dry leaves. The heat wave vibrated the air. Howard felt the turbulence shake his aircraft, but he maintained his course. The second formation of 4 P-47s came in right behind, attacking the opposite side of the base. They targeted the still intact aircraft and support facilities. A wooden control tower collapsed after taking a series of hits. Transport vehicles caught fire. A tanker truck exploded, sending debris flying in all directions. The German base, which seconds before had been operating calmly, was now a scene of utter confusion. German pilots racing toward their planes stopped dead in their tracks, unsure whether to continue or seek shelter. The anti-aircraft batteries finally reacted. Red tracers rose from the ground in irregular arcs, trying to intercept the attackers. But the German gunners weren't trained for targets at such low altitude and high speed. They aimed for where the planes had been, not where they were. The bursts passed behind the American aircraft, cutting through the empty air. A ground machine gun managed to hit the tail of a P-47, leaving visible marks on the rudder. The pilot felt the impact, checked the controls, and continued. The Thunderbolt's robust structure absorbed the damage without compromising its flight. Howard was already exiting the attack area. He maintained low altitude, using a line of trees for visual cover. The other pilots followed in a loose formation, each choosing a slightly different route to hinder enemy response. The total attack time had been no more than 40 seconds, but in those 40 seconds, 8 German aircraft had been destroyed, 3 hangars damaged, and the base's operational capability drastically reduced. Howard glanced in the cockpit rearview mirror. Columns of black smoke spiraled against the orange dusk sky. The mission was complete. The return flight was silent. The pilots maintained radio discipline, communicating only essential information about fuel and damage. Howard led the formation back through the same low-altitude corridor, crossing cultivated fields, small villages and back roads. French farmers working the land raised their arms as they saw the American planes fly by. Some waved. Others simply watched, motionless, trying to understand what had happened. War was made of moments like these, brief and intense, that altered the balance without most people realizing it. As the formation recrossed the English Channel, the tension began to ease. The pilots climbed to cruising altitude, allowing the engines to work more efficiently. The English coast appeared as a dark line against the horizon. The airbase's lights flashed in an identification sequence. Howard deployed the landing gear and adjusted for final approach. Touchdown was gentle, almost imperceptible. The tires squealed against the wet asphalt. The aircraft rolled into the parking area, where mechanics were already waiting to inspect the damage. Howard cut the engine and removed his helmet. The silence that followed was profound, almost unreal after hours of listening to the constant roar of the radial. He stepped off the wing and walked toward the briefing room. There was no celebration, just the work of recording what had happened, analyzing what worked and what needed to be adjusted. The war continued, and that had been only the first mission. The real question remained unanswered. Would the tactic work on a larger scale? And what would the Luftwaffe's reaction be when it realized what was happening? Reports reached the 8th Air Army Fighter Command before dawn the following day. Reconnaissance photographs taken hours after the attack confirmed the results. 8 Messerschmitt, 109s completely destroyed, 3 hangars rendered useless, a fuel depot reduced to smoldering rubble. The German base near Reims had been effectively neutralized for less than an hour. The numbers were impressive, but the strategic impact went beyond statistics. For the first time, the Luftwaffe had been attacked where it felt safe, on the ground, in its own facilities. Without warning, the American commander's reaction was immediate. If a single mission with 8 aircraft could destroy an entire base, what would happen with 50 aircraft simultaneously attacking multiple targets? Bomber escort doctrine began to be rethought. Fighters no longer needed to simply protect formations at altitude. They could become independent offensive weapons, capable of paralyzing enemy reaction before the bombers even crossed the channel. Air strategy over Europe was changing, and James Howard had proven that the shift was viable. But the Luftwaffe was not an enemy that accepted defeats passively. German commanders analyzed the wreckage and witness reports. They realized the attack had come from an extremely low altitude, below the effective range of early warning radars. They understood that the speed and element of surprise rendered conventional anti-aircraft defenses nearly useless. The response needed to be swift. Orders were issued to all bases in occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Increase the number of light anti-aircraft machine guns around the perimeters, install firing positions on high ground, maintain constant ground surveillance patrols, disperse the aircraft over larger areas, making concentrated attacks more difficult. Meanwhile, Howard was preparing the second wave of missions. This time, the target would be more ambitious. A base in the Normandy region near the city of Caen, where American intelligence had identified the presence of at least 20 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. These planes were more dangerous than the Messerschmitts. Faster, more heavily armed and specifically designed to destroy heavy bombers. Neutralizing that base meant protecting dozens of B-17 crews who would fly over the region in the following days. The mission was scheduled for the early morning of April 23, 1944. 12 P-47s were assigned to the attack. Howard would divide the formation into 3 groups of 4 aircraft, each attacking a different sector of the base simultaneously. Coordination needed to be perfect. Any delay would allow the defenses to react. The pilots studied recent photographs. They memorized the position of every hangar, every tower, every access road. Approach routes were plotted using rivers, roads, and natural formations as references. The time chosen was 2 hours before dawn, when darkness still covered the terrain, but there was already enough light on the horizon to identify targets. Takeoff took place under a clear, cold sky. The stars shone with unusual intensity. The engines of the P-47s broke the silence of the English base, one after another, until all 12 were airborne, climbing in tight formation. Howard led the way, navigating by instruments until he crossed the channel. The black water reflected the faint light of the crescent moon. There was no visible shipping traffic, only the emptiness of the sea and the constant sound of radials cutting through the night. Upon reaching the French coast, the formation descended abruptly, from 2,000 meters to 50 in a matter of minutes. The transition required absolute control. Descending too quickly meant losing stability. Descending too slowly meant being detected by coastal radar. Howard adjusted power and descent angle with surgical precision. The others followed, maintaining a safe distance between the aircraft. As they stabilized at low altitude, the world changed. The lights of French villages appeared as isolated dots in the darkness. Church steeples stood out against the sky. The terrain seemed to appear without warning, demanding instant reactions. Night navigation at low altitudes was more difficult than during the day. Visual references disappeared in the darkness. Howard relied on a compass, a stopwatch, and memory. He counted the seconds between each landmark. A bridge, a river bend, a road intersection. Every detail had been studied until it became automatic. The other pilots trusted him completely. There was no room for doubt. Deviating from the course meant getting lost, consuming unnecessary fuel, and jeopardizing the mission. Then ahead, the first lights of the German base appeared. Dim, scattered, but unmistakable. Control towers illuminated. Searchlights were off, but their structures were visible. Hangars formed rectangular silhouettes against the sky that was beginning to lighten on the horizon. Howard briefly activated the radio. A single word. Contact. The formation separated, each group adjusting their angle of approach to attack simultaneously from different directions. Howard's internal stopwatch ticked away. 3, 2, 1. He cocked his machine guns and dove toward the first target. War, once again, was about to break out where least expected. The pre-dawn silence exploded into coordinated violence. The 3 groups of P-47s attacked simultaneously, coming from opposite directions, transforming the German base into a triangle of crossfire. Howard targeted the first Focke-Wulf 190 to appear ahead. The 50 caliber machine guns fired in controlled bursts. The shells pierced the German fighter's fuselage, tearing off chunks of metal that flew like shrapnel. The fuel tank ruptured. Orange flames rose rapidly, illuminating the surrounding ground with an eerie glow. Howard was already adjusting his aim to the next target before the first was even completely engulfed in flames. To his right, another P-47 fired at a line of 3 Focke-Wulfs parked in tight formation. The impacts were devastating. The first plane partially disintegrated, losing its left wing, which fell onto the second. The third was hit in the engine, which began belching thick black smoke. In less than 10 seconds, 3 German fighters were disabled. The American pilot didn't celebrate. He simply banked the aircraft to the left and continued scanning the area for new targets. Discipline was absolute. Every wasted second was an opportunity for the enemy to react. On the opposite side of the base, the second group attacked the main hangars. The metal structures were large and vulnerable. The .50 caliber shells easily passed through the walls, hitting tools, spare parts, and fuel drums stored inside. A secondary explosion shook the hangar closest to the control tower. The shockwave shattered the tower's windows. Glass rained down on German soldiers who ran in all directions, unsure whether to scramble for weapons, enter shelters, or try to save the planes. The chaos was total and intentional. Every second of confusion increased the attackers' advantage. The third group focused on support vehicles and fuel installations. Tanker trucks were the first targets. One of them exploded with brutal force, sending a fireball soaring 30 meters into the air. The momentary brightness illuminated the entire base as if it were day. Other vehicles caught fire in quick succession. A troop transport truck rolled onto its side after its tires were destroyed. Soldiers jumped from the back and dove to the ground, seeking any available cover. Some fired rifles at the American planes, but it was like trying to hit birds in flight with stones, futile and desperate. This time, however, the German defense was more prepared. The orders received days earlier had been implemented. MG-42 light anti-aircraft machine gun positions were strategically positioned around the perimeter. When the attack began, German gunners reacted with impressive speed. Green tracers began to rise from the ground, streaking across the space in all directions. The difference from the first attack was evident. Now there was real firepower. Now there was a real danger. One of the P-47s from the second group was hit in the right wing. The impacts ripped off chunks of the aileron and punctured the auxiliary tank. Fuel began to leak, leaving a thin trail in the air. The pilot felt the aircraft pull to the side. He compensated with the stick, applying constant pressure to maintain level flight. The situation was serious, but manageable. The Thunderbolt was known for its endurance. Pilots often said the plane could return home even with half its fuselage ripped off. He decided to end the attack before assessing the damage. He fired at an ammunition dump, which exploded in a cascade, one detonation fueling the next. The entire base vibrated with the force of the explosions. Howard completed his first pass and began a second, more daring one. He flew directly over the control tower, so low he could see German faces in the broken windows. He fired at a radio antenna that collapsed onto the roof. Without centralized communication, coordinating the defense became even more difficult. He pulled back on the stick to avoid a flagpole and exited the base on the west side, where the tree cover offered protection from ground fire. Adrenaline didn't alter his breathing. His movements were mechanical, automatic, the product of intense training and accumulated experience. Meanwhile, the pilot of the damaged P-47 faced difficult decisions. The fuel leak was increasing. The wing was responding poorly to commands. He assessed the distance to the coast, calculated the remaining fuel consumption, and concluded that he had a minimal margin. He radioed Howard, using a previously agreed-upon code. 2 words: "Bird down." Howard responded immediately, ordering another pilot to form escort alongside him. The two broke away from the main formation and headed directly for the channel. The mission continued, but no pilot would be left behind. At the German base, the fire was spreading out of control. 17 Focke-Wulfs had been destroyed or severely damaged. 4 hangars were ablaze. 2 fuel depots had exploded. The control tower was out of commission. Vehicles were burning in various parts of the camp. German soldiers finally began organizing firefighting teams, but the infrastructure was compromised. Hoses lacked sufficient pressure. Fire extinguishers were running out quickly. The entire base would need weeks to return to full operation. And weeks, at that stage of the war, were a strategic eternity. Howard regrouped the remaining planes and began the return. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon. Hues of purple and orange replaced the pre-dawn darkness. The formation flew in disciplined silence, maintaining low altitude until they crossed the coast. Only over the channel did they allow themselves to climb to cruising altitude. The pilot of the damaged Thunderbolt held firm in formation, constantly adjusting power to compensate for the additional drag caused by the punctured wing. Fuel was critical. But he knew he could make it. He had to. As the lights of the English coast appeared ahead, the tension finally began to ease. The airbase appeared as a bright spot against the dark green of the fields. Howard radioed and requested landing priority for the damaged aircraft. The tower responded immediately, clearing the runway and deploying emergency crews. The injured Thunderbolt landed first, touching down gently despite its damage. It rolled to a stop on the grass beside the runway, fuel exhausted. The pilot shut off the engine and sat for a few seconds, barely breathing. Then he opened the cockpit and climbed out. His legs trembled slightly, but he was alive. He was home. Howard landed soon after, followed by the others. When he cut the engine and silence filled the cockpit, he closed his eyes for a brief moment. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was simply the acknowledgement that the mission had been accomplished, that the tactic was working, that the Luftwaffe now faced a problem with no immediate solution, and that the air war over Europe had changed irreversibly. He removed his helmet, stepped off the wing and walked toward the debriefing room. There were reports to write, data to record, and new missions to plan, because this was just beginning. The days following the Caen raid irreversibly transformed American air doctrine. The 8th Air Army's Fighter Command issued new operational directives. All fighter units based in England would receive training in low-altitude attacks. Priority targets were identified throughout occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Over 150 German airfields were catalogued, photographed, and analyzed. The operation received an official name, Operation Strafe, or, as the pilots began to call it among themselves, ground fox hunting. It was a reference to the Focke-Wulf fighters, but also to what the mission truly represented, hunting the predator before it could take off. James Howard was summoned to meetings in London. Generals wanted to understand every detail of the tactics, how the pilots navigated at such low altitude, how they identified targets at maximum speed, how they avoided anti-aircraft fire, how they maintained coordination without constant radio communication. Howard responded with the same objectivity he applied in combat. He explained that the key was intensive training and absolute discipline. Pilots needed to memorize routes completely. They needed to understand the terrain as infantry, not as aviators. They needed to accept that there was no room for improvisation. Every move was calculated. Every second counted. The margin between success and disaster was measured in meters and fractions of a second. The generals listened and approved the immediate expansion of the operation. In the following weeks, entire fighter groups were assigned to ground attack missions. Republic P-47, Thunderbolts and North American P-51 Mustangs began crossing the channel daily, no longer just escorting bombers, but actively attacking enemy bases. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. More anti-aircraft batteries were installed. Aircraft began to be dispersed in forested areas, camouflaged under nets and branches. Ground surveillance patrols were intensified, but the math was relentless. Defending dozens of bases simultaneously required resources Germany no longer had. In May 1944, on the eve of the Normandy invasion, Allied air superiority over France was nearly absolute. The Luftwaffe had lost hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. Entire bases were abandoned after repeated attacks. German pilots, who managed to take off, faced not only American fighters at altitude, but also the constant threat of having their base destroyed while in the air, with no safe place to land. The morale of German fighter units plummeted. Allied intelligence reports captured intercepted conversations in which Luftwaffe pilots expressed frustration and despair. Some described feeling hunted like animals, with no real means of defense. The low-altitude attack tactic Howard had first tested in March had become operational standard across the Allied Tactical Air Force, but the cost was not negligible. Dozens of P-47s and P-51s were lost on ground attack missions. Some were hit by anti-aircraft fire. Others crashed into obstacles while flying at low altitudes. Church towers, high-tension cables, trees at unexpected elevations. The margin for error was non-existent. Pilots who made even a single miscalculation paid with their lives. But the strategic results justified the risks. Every German base neutralized meant fewer interceptions of bombers, fewer crew losses, more missions completed successfully. The Germans attempted to counterattack with similar tactics, but they lacked sufficient fuel and pilots trained for low-altitude operations over enemy territory. The few attempts resulted in disproportionate losses. The initiative had completely shifted. What had previously been the Luftwaffe's preserve now belonged to the Allies, and this tactical shift had direct consequences for the success of D-Day. When Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was unable to offer significant air resistance. German fighters attempting to attack the landing craft were intercepted before they even reached the coast. Allied air cover was so dominant that soldiers on the ground barely saw enemy aircraft during the critical first days of the invasion. Howard continued flying missions until the end of the war. He never spoke publicly of heroism or glory. When interviewed years later, he described his actions as an application of tactical logic. He had identified a vulnerability in the enemy system and systematically exploited it. Nothing more, nothing less. In January 1945, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. The ceremony was brief. He offered a few words of thanks and returned to work. For him, war wasn't about medals. It was about ending the conflict as quickly as possible, with the fewest casualties on his side. And the low-altitude attack tactic had directly contributed to this goal. In the decades that followed, the doctrine Howard helped create became the foundation of modern air warfare. Suppression strikes on enemy bases before the start of larger operations, use of low altitude to evade radar, speed and surprise as primary weapons, precise coordination between multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously. All these elements, first tested over the skies of occupied France in 1944, were incorporated into the tactics manuals of air forces around the world. Warfare evolved, technology advanced, but the fundamental principles remained. Deny the enemy the ability to react, strike where they are most vulnerable, turn their forces into targets before they can become threats. The Luftwaffe, which dominated European skies in 1940, was systematically destroyed, not only in the air, but also on the ground. Its bases, its depots, its entire infrastructure were targeted in a coordinated campaign that gave no respite or room for recovery. And it all began with a small group of pilots flying as low as the treetops, catching the enemy completely off guard. It was a shift that didn't make dramatic headlines at the time. There were no epic battles witnessed by crowds, just men making cold calculations, making difficult decisions, and executing extremely dangerous missions with absolute discipline. Today, when studying the air campaign over Europe during World War II, the numbers tell part of the story. Thousands of planes destroyed, hundreds of bases neutralized, air superiority gained and maintained, but the numbers don't capture the visceral reality of those flights. The deafening sound of radial engines at full power, the constant vibration of the fuselage, the biting cold at altitude, the suffocating heat during attacks on summer days, the smell of burning powder and fuel, the tension of cruising meters above the ground at over 500 kilometers per hour, the responsibility of decisions that determined life and death in fractions of a second. This was the reality for the men who flew these missions, and it was a reality that demanded more than courage. It demanded absolute technical precision. James Howard died in 1995, at the age of 81. He spent the last decades of his life out of the spotlight, working in civil aviation and rarely discussing his wartime experience. When asked how he felt about having changed the history of military aviation, he replied that he had changed nothing. He had merely applied logic to the problem presented to him. But those who flew with him, those who studied his tactics, and those who benefited from the air superiority he helped achieve, knew the truth. He had transformed aerial warfare. He had proven that tactical innovation could overcome material advantages. He had demonstrated that discipline and training were worth more than reckless daring, and he had saved countless lives by shortening the war. Military history is replete with decisive moments that changed the course of conflicts, famous battles, celebrated generals, revolutionary inventions, but some of the most important changes happened away from the spotlight, in missions carried out by small groups of highly competent people doing extremely difficult work. The decision to fly low, to attack the enemy on the ground, to transform fighter jets into weapons of strategic suppression was one such change. And it began with a Missouri pilot who understood that war wasn't about glory, it was about results. And the results, in the end, spoke for themselves. If you've made it this far, I hope this story has shown you how seemingly simple tactical decisions can have profound strategic consequences, how discipline and training trump improvisation, and how war is fought not just by generals in command rooms, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary situations with extraordinary competence. If this content added to your knowledge of military history, please leave a like below. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss the next episodes. There's much more forgotten history waiting to be told. Until next time.